Everyone deserves to be loved, yet some souls walk through life believing they never will be. In the frontier town of Red Rock, Hattie knows this pain all too well. The townspeople call her the Monster Bride and cross the street when she passes. Children hide behind their mothers' skirts. No man has ever looked at her with kindness, let alone love. But when mountain man Silas McGraw rides into town, everything changes. He sees her heart, not her scars. He sees her strength, not her flaws. In one brave moment, he does what no man has ever dared. He kisses her, but can their love survive a town determined to destroy it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1874 painted Red Rock in shades of amber and rust, but no beauty could soften the harsh edges of frontier life. Dust swirled through the main street like restless spirits, settling on weathered storefronts and hitching posts that had seen better days. The town sat nestled in a valley between rolling hills, a place where dreams came to either flourish or die under the unforgiving Montana sky. Hattie Mae Caldwell stood at her boarding house window, watching the world through warped glass that distorted everything it touched. How fitting, she thought, that even her view of the world came filtered through something broken. The worn wedding dress hung on the back of her door, like a ghost of hopes long abandoned, its ivory silk now yellowed with age and disappointment. She had carried that dress in her trunk for 3 years, through 2 failed engagements and countless sleepless nights, wondering if any man would ever see past the jagged scars that ran from her left temple down to her jaw. The accident had happened when she was 17, a simple fall from her father's barn while helping with the harvest. But the rusty nail that caught her face had torn away more than flesh. It had stolen her future, or so everyone believed. The infection that followed had left its own cruel signature, a patchwork of raised skin that made children stare and grown men look away in discomfort. "There goes the scarred woman," they whispered when she walked to the mercantile. Shame about her face. She was pretty once, they say. But Hattie remembered a different truth. She had never been considered beautiful, even before the accident. Plain, perhaps, unremarkable. The scars had simply given people a reason to voice what they had always thought in silence. Now, at 26, she found herself in Red Rock because a well-meaning matchmaker in Denver had convinced a widower named Edgar Thompson that a scarred bride was better than no bride at all for a man with 5 children to raise. Edgar had taken one look at her, stepping off the stage, and disappeared into the crowd like smoke in the wind. That was 3 weeks ago, and Hattie had been living off her meager savings ever since, too proud to return home to Ohio, and too practical to believe another suitor would miraculously appear. The boarding house landlady, Mrs. Gertrude Hartwell, made no secret of her displeasure at housing an unmarried woman whose intended had fled. She was a thin, sharp-faced woman who wore disapproval like her best dress, and she never missed an opportunity to remind Hattie that decent women didn't linger in frontier towns without proper escorts. "Respectable ladies don't stay here indefinitely," Mrs. Hartwell would say, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "This is a temporary establishment for those in transition, not a permanent residence for those society has," she would pause delicately, "overlooked." The other residents of Red Rock treated Hattie with a mixture of pity and suspicion that somehow felt worse than outright hostility. There was Reverend Augustus Pike, a man who preached about Christian charity on Sundays, but crossed himself when he encountered her on weekdays. His wife, Constance, organized prayer circles that specifically excluded Hattie, claiming that her presence made the other ladies uncomfortable. Dr. Henry Morrison, the town's physician, was one of the few who treated her with professional courtesy, though his kindness felt clinical rather than warm. He'd examined her scars when she first arrived, explaining to anyone who asked that they posed no danger to others, as if her isolation stemmed from fear of contagion rather than simple cruelty. The mercantile owner, Samuel Tucker, was perhaps the closest thing to a friend she had found in Red Rock. A middle-aged man whose own war wounds had left him with a pronounced limp, he understood something about carrying visible reminders of life's harder lessons. He would nod respectfully when she entered his store and never rushed her through her purchases, though she noticed he waited until other customers had left before engaging in any real conversation. "Takes courage to start over in a new place," he had told her just yesterday, weighing out her weekly portion of flour. Most folks don't appreciate that kind of strength. But even Sam's kindness came with limitations. He had a business to protect and a reputation to maintain in a town where reputation mattered more than most currencies. Hattie had learned to navigate the unspoken rules of Red Rock society with careful precision. She shopped early in the morning, when the streets were empty. She attended church, but sat in the back pew where her presence wouldn't disturb others. She kept her head down and her voice soft, making herself as invisible as possible while still existing in the world. Her small room above the boarding house had become both sanctuary and prison. She had arranged her few possessions with meticulous care. Her mother's Bible on the nightstand, a daguerreotype of her parents on the dresser, and a small collection of books that served as her primary companions. She spent her evenings reading, by candlelight, losing herself in stories of adventure and romance that seemed to exist in a different universe from her own quiet existence. During the day, she occupied herself with mending and sewing, skills that provided both purpose and small income. Word had spread quietly that she possessed exceptional needlework abilities, and several of the town's ladies would discreetly slip her their alterations and repairs, though they took care never to be seen entering her boarding house. The work was satisfying in a way that surprised her. There was something deeply peaceful about taking something torn or damaged and making it whole again. She found herself thinking that perhaps this was her calling, not marriage and motherhood, as she had once dreamed, but the quiet art of mending what others had broken or discarded. Yet loneliness was a constant companion that no amount of busy work could entirely banish. She missed conversation, laughter, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with someone who enjoyed her company. She missed feeling valued, needed, wanted. Most of all, she missed the possibility of love, not the desperate, grateful affection she had once been prepared to settle for with Edgar Thompson, but the kind of deep, transformative connection she read about in her novels and saw occasionally in the eyes of couples who had found something rare and precious in each other. On this particular October morning, as she watched the town begin its daily routine through her distorted window, Hattie felt the familiar weight of another day stretching ahead like an empty road. Mrs. Hartwell would serve breakfast with her usual pointed comments about ladies who lingered past their welcome. The townspeople would go about their business with carefully averted eyes. The sun would set on another day of invisible existence. She was considering whether to attempt another trip to the mercantile when the sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the street below. A lone rider was approaching from the north, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone comfortable in the wilderness. Even from her second-story window, Hattie could see that this was not one of Red Rock's usual visitors. The man sat his horse like he had been born in the saddle, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that touched his collar and a beard that spoke of months in the mountains. His clothes were practical rather than fashionable, leather vest over a wool shirt, worn boots that had covered countless miles, and a hat that had weathered more storms than most men ever faced. But it was something else that caught her attention, something in the way he surveyed the town with neither judgment nor eagerness. He looked like a man who had seen enough of the world to understand that places and people were more complicated than they appeared on the surface. There was a quality of patient observation in his bearing that suggested he formed his own opinions. Rather than accepting those handed to him by others, Hattie found herself leaning closer to the window, curious despite herself. Strangers were common enough in Red Rock, but this one felt different. He dismounted in front of the saloon with fluid grace, securing his horse with the economical movements of someone who wasted no motion. When he removed his hat to run a hand through his hair, she glimpsed a face that was ruggedly handsome in the way of men who had been shaped by weather and experience rather than careful grooming. For just a moment, he looked up at the boarding house windows, and Hattie instinctively stepped back into the shadows, but not before she caught a glimpse of eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding and perhaps, though she hardly dared hope, kindness. As the stranger disappeared into the saloon, Hattie remained by her window, feeling something she hadn't experienced in months: curiosity about another human being. She wondered who he was, where he had come from, and what had brought him to Red Rock. Most of all, she wondered if he might be the kind of man who looked at the world and the people in it with eyes unclouded by prejudice and assumption. The worn wedding dress still hung on her door, like a reminder of abandoned dreams. But for the first time in weeks, Hattie found herself wondering if perhaps her story in Red Rock was not yet finished. 3 days later, Hattie's world changed forever in the most public and humiliating way possible. She had ventured out for her weekly supplies, choosing the early afternoon when most decent folk would be occupied with their own affairs. But as she approached the town square, she heard the sound of raucous laughter and cruel voices raised. In mock celebration, a crowd had gathered near the old oak tree that served as the town's unofficial meeting place. At its center stood Edgar Thompson, the man who had abandoned her at the altar of expectation, holding a bottle of whiskey and gesturing wildly to his audience of amused spectators. Beside him, someone had constructed a grotesque scarecrow, dressed in what looked suspiciously like a woman's traveling dress, complete with a veil that had been torn and stained with mud. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edgar called out, his words slurred with alcohol and malice, "I present to you my intended bride." He gestured toward the scarecrow with exaggerated gallantry. "Isn't she lovely? Just the kind of woman a man dreams of, waking up next to every morning for the rest of his natural life." The crowd erupted in laughter. Hattie recognized many of the faces: shopkeepers she had patronized, women whose sewing she had done in secret, men who had tipped their hats to her in passing. Now they stood unified in their amusement at her expense, their civility stripped away by the permission Edgar's cruelty had given them. "Now, Edgar," called out Bill Martinez, the saloon keeper, "don't be too hard on the poor creature. Some men might find that kind of character appealing." "Character?" Edgar repeated, swaying slightly. "Yes, that's what you call it when a woman's face could stop a charging bull. Character!" He stumbled toward the scarecrow and made an exaggerated show of trying to embrace it. "Come here, darling. Give your devoted husband a kiss." The crowd roared with approval as Edgar pretended to recoil in horror from his makeshift bride. "Good Lord, even a scarecrow version is too frightful to touch." Hattie stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. She should leave. She should turn around and walk away, preserve what little dignity remained to her. But her feet seemed rooted to the dusty ground, and she found herself trapped in the nightmare of public humiliation. "Maybe we should find her a real husband," suggested Martha Davies, the baker's wife, her voice sharp with false sweetness. "I'm sure there's some poor soul desperate enough to overlook her unfortunate circumstances." "Who would want damaged goods?" Edgar shot back. "A man has a right to expect his wife won't frighten the children or sour the milk just by walking past." That was when she felt the gentle touch on her elbow. Hattie turned to find the stranger from 3 days ago standing beside her, his dark eyes focused not on the spectacle before them, but on her face. Up close, she could see that his eyes were the deep brown of rich earth, and they held an expression of quiet fury that somehow comforted rather than frightened her. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice carrying the distinctive cadence of a man who had spent more time talking to horses and mountains than to people. "Would you do me the honor of allowing me to escort you away from this unpleasantness?" But before she could respond, Edgar had spotted them. "Well, well," he called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Look what we have here. Hattie's found herself a champion." He squinted at the newcomer with the exaggerated focus of the very drunk. "You must be new in town, friend, or you'd know better than to associate with our local monster." The stranger, Hattie still didn't know his name, turned slowly to face Edgar and the crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the square despite its quiet tone. "I reckon I've been called worse things by better men than you, friend." Edgar's face flushed red. "Better men? You don't even know who you're talking to. I'm Edgar Thompson, and I've got standing in this community. I own the largest spread east of here, and I've got the sense God gave a jackrabbit, which is more than I can say for anyone fool enough to court that creature." "Creature?" the stranger repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "That's an interesting word choice for a man describing a lady." "Lady?" Edgar laughed, but there was less confidence in it now. "You must need spectacles, friend. That thing ain't no lady." The stranger took 2 steps forward, and suddenly the crowd's laughter died away. There was something in his bearing that suggested Edgar was pushing against a force far more dangerous than he realized. "I see just fine," the stranger said. "I see a woman who deserves better than to be mocked by a coward who runs away from his commitments. I see a lady who has more courage in her little finger than you've got in your whole sorry hide." "Now see here," Edgar began. But the stranger wasn't finished. "And I see a crowd of people who ought to be ashamed of themselves for taking pleasure in another person's pain." His gaze swept across the assembled townspeople, and Hattie watched several of them suddenly find urgent business elsewhere. "Where I come from, we were taught to judge a person by their character, not their appearance. But I suppose that's expecting too much from folks who get their entertainment from tormenting their neighbors." Edgar, emboldened by whiskey and the support of the crowd, stepped closer. "You talk mighty big for a saddle tramp who just rode into town. You got no idea what you're dealing with here." "Is that so?" The stranger's hand moved to rest casually on the grip of the Colt at his hip. "Why don't you enlighten me?" The gesture was subtle, but Edgar sobered quickly. He glanced around at the crowd, looking for support, but found that most of his audience had mysteriously evaporated. Only a handful of the most dedicated gossips remained, and even they looked uncomfortable. "This ain't over," Edgar muttered, but he was already backing away. "I believe it is," the stranger replied. Then, before anyone could react, he turned to Hattie and said, "Ma'am, I'd still be honored to escort you anywhere you'd care to go." Hattie found her voice at last. "I thank you, but you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said gently. "I want to." And then, in front of what remained of the crowd, in full view of Edgar Thompson and anyone else who cared to watch, he did something that shocked every person present into absolute silence. He stepped closer to Hattie, removed his hat with one hand, and gently cupped her scarred cheek with the other. "My name is Silas McGraw," he said, his voice carrying clearly. "In the sudden hush, and I'd consider myself the luckiest man in Montana if you'd allow me to call on you properly." Before she could protest or pull away, before her own fears could stop her from accepting this impossible gift, Silas leaned down and kissed her. Not a quick, pitying peck, but a real kiss, gentle, respectful, and utterly sincere. His lips were warm and firm against hers, and for a moment that felt like eternity, Hattie experienced something she had never dared dream of, being kissed by a man who wanted to kiss her. When he pulled back, his eyes held hers with steady warmth. "Miss Caldwell," he said, somehow knowing her name though they had never been introduced, "would you do me the honor of taking a walk with me?" Hattie was dimly aware of the shocked murmurs rippling through what remained of the crowd. Of Edgar. Thompson's face twisted with disbelief, of Mrs. Hartwell's scandalized gasp from somewhere behind them. But all of that seemed to belong to a different world than the one she suddenly found herself inhabiting. A world where a man could see past her scars to whatever lay beneath. A world where she might actually be worth wanting. "Yes," she whispered. her voice barely audible, then stronger. "Yes, Mr. McGraw, I would like that very much." As they walked away from the square, Silas offering his arm with the same courtesy he might show a duchess, Hattie felt the weight of every stare following them. But for the first time since arriving in Red Rock, she didn't care what people thought. The silver locket at her throat, her one remaining piece of jewelry from her previous life, seemed to catch the afternoon light, and she found herself remembering the girl she had been before the world taught her to hide. The walk Silas proposed took them along the creek that wound behind the town, following a path worn smooth by years of foot traffic and seasonal floods. Here, away from prying eyes and wagging tongues, Hattie felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. The afternoon sun filtered through cottonwood trees, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the water's surface. "I hope you don't mind that I knew your name," Silas said, as they found their pace together. "Sam Tucker at the Mercantile mentioned you when I was buying supplies. He speaks highly of your character." "Sam is kind," Hattie replied, still hardly believing she was walking arm in arm with this man who had just turned her world upside down. "He's one of the few people in Red Rock who treats me like a human being rather than a cautionary tale." Silas was quiet for a moment, and she worried she had said too much, revealed too much bitterness. But when he spoke, his voice held only understanding. "I've spent most of my life in places where a man's worth is measured by what he does, not what he looks like. The mountains don't care if you're handsome or scarred. They only care if you're strong enough to survive them." They paused beside a fallen log that made a natural bench, and Silas gestured for her to sit. From his vest pocket, he produced a small object wrapped in soft leather. "I made this for you," he said simply, placing it in her hands. Hattie unwrapped the leather to reveal a wooden comb, carved from what looked like cherry wood and polished to a warm gleam. The handle was decorated with delicate wildflowers, mountain asters, and Indian paintbrush, each petal rendered with careful attention to detail. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever given her. "You made this?" she asked, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "But you've only been in town for 3 days." "I've been watching you for 3 days," he admitted without embarrassment. "Saw you at your window that first morning, and I knew I wanted to know you better. A man learns patience in the mountains. Patience and the value of taking time to do things right." The admission should have frightened her, but instead it filled her with a warm glow she hadn't felt since childhood. Someone had noticed her, had thought her worth noticing. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Not nearly as beautiful as the woman it's meant for," Silas said quietly, and when she looked up at him in surprise, she found his eyes serious and sincere. "I know that might be hard for you to believe, given how this town has treated you, but I see what they can't or won't." "What do you see?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, driven by a desperate need to understand how this man could look at her with such warmth when everyone else saw only something to be pitied or avoided. Silas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze taking in her face with careful consideration. "I see strength," he said finally. "The kind of strength that lets a woman hold her head high when the world tries to beat her down. I see kindness in your eyes, real kindness, the sort that comes from understanding pain. I see intelligence and dignity and 100 other things that have nothing to do with scars." Tears pricked at Hattie's eyes, and she looked down at the comb in her hands. "You don't really know me, Mr. McGraw. What if when you do, you realize you were mistaken?" "Silas," he corrected gently. "And I'm not mistaken. A man learns to read people when his life depends on knowing who to trust. You're the kind of woman worth knowing, Hattie Caldwell. The kind worth fighting for." The warmth in his voice made her look up again, and she found him watching her with an expression of such genuine caring that it took her breath away. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you fight for someone like me?" "Because someone should have been fighting for you all along," he said simply. "Because every person deserves to be valued for who they are, not dismissed for what they're not. And because—" He paused, then continued with quiet honesty, "Because I think I could fall in love with you, given the chance." The words hung between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. Love was a luxury she had long ago convinced herself she would never afford. But looking at Silas, really looking at him, she saw no deception, no pity, no hidden agenda. Just a man who somehow saw worth in her when she had almost forgotten her own value. "The town won't like it," she said, testing the waters of possibility. "They already think I'm unfit for decent society. If you're seen courting me properly, they'll turn on you too." Silas chuckled, a sound like distant thunder. "Hattie, I've spent the last 5 years living alone in the mountains, talking mostly to my horse and the occasional bear. The good opinion of Red Rock society isn't exactly something I've been lying awake nights worrying about. But you have to live somewhere, have some connection to civilization. A man can't survive entirely alone forever." "Maybe not forever," he agreed. "But I can survive the disapproval of people whose approval isn't worth having in the first place. The question is whether you can." It was a fair question, and Hattie considered it carefully. For weeks, she had been trying to make herself invisible, to avoid drawing the town's ire or attention. She had measured her worth by their standards and found herself wanting. But what if their standards were wrong? What if the opinion that mattered was her own, and that of a man who had proven himself capable of seeing past surfaces to the person beneath? "I'd like to try," she said finally, "if you're willing to be patient with me while I learn how." "Patience is something I've got plenty of," Silas assured her. "We'll take it as slow as you need. Do things proper and respectful. I'm not going anywhere, Hattie. Not unless you ask me to." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the creek babble over stones and the gentle rustle of cottonwood leaves. Hattie found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months, the comb warm in her hands like a promise of better things to come. "Will you tell me about yourself?" she asked eventually. "About your life in the mountains?" Silas seemed to consider the question carefully. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," she said, then laughed at her own boldness. "I'm sorry, that's probably too much. I've spent so much time alone with only books for company. I'd forgotten how nice it is to talk with someone who actually wants to talk back." "Everything. Might take a while," Silas said with a smile that transformed his weathered face, "but I reckon we've got time." He told her about his cabin in the high country, built with his own hands from trees he had felled and stones he had quarried. He described mornings when the mist rose from the valleys like spirits returning to heaven, and winters when the snow lay so deep and pure that the world seemed remade in crystal and silence. He spoke of tracking elk through ancient forests, of nights spent by campfires under stars, so bright they seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. As he talked, Hattie found herself enchanted not just by his stories, but by the man himself. There was poetry in the way he described the natural world, a deep reverence for the beauty and power of wild places. Here was a man who had found peace in solitude, who understood the value of quiet contemplation and simple pleasures. "It sounds wonderful," she said when he paused. "Lonely, perhaps, but wonderful." "It was lonely sometimes," he admitted, "but I thought that was just the way it had to be. Some men aren't meant for domestic life, for fitting into society's expectations. I figured I was one of them." "What changed your mind?" Silas looked at her with an expression so tender it made her heart race. "I saw you," he said simply. "Saw you trying to be invisible, carrying yourself with such dignity despite how they treated you. Saw you reading by your window in the evenings, looking like you were searching for something you'd lost. And I realized maybe I'd been wrong about myself. Maybe I wasn't meant to be alone forever. Maybe I was just waiting for the right person to share it all with." Over the following weeks, Silas's courtship of Hattie became the primary source of speculation and scandal in Red Rock. He called on her every day, arriving at the boarding house with the punctuality of a man who had learned to measure time by the sun's movement across mountain peaks. Mrs. Hartwell greeted these visits with increasingly elaborate displays of disapproval, but she couldn't deny him entry when he conducted himself with perfect propriety, and Hattie received him willingly. Their meetings followed the prescribed patterns of respectable courtship, conducted in the boarding-house parlor under Mrs. Hartwell's watchful eye or on carefully chaperoned walks through town. But even within these constrained boundaries, Hattie felt her world expanding in ways she had never imagined possible. Silas brought her wildflowers from his morning rides, Indian paintbrush, mountain asters, and delicate bluebells that he arranged. In a tin cup beside her chair, she began pressing these flowers between the pages of her books, creating a collection that grew more precious to her with each passing day. Each blossom represented a moment of thoughtfulness, proof that someone remembered her preferences and cared enough to act on that knowledge. "I've never seen flowers arranged like this before," she told him one afternoon, admiring a particularly lovely bouquet of wild columbines. "They look like they're dancing." "Mountain flowers have to be tough to survive up there," Silas explained, his weathered hands gentle as he adjusted the stems. "But they're also the most beautiful things you'll ever see because they've earned their beauty through surviving hardship. Reminds me of someone I know." The comparison made her blush, but she was beginning to understand that Silas's compliments came from genuine observation rather than empty flattery. He saw beauty in things others overlooked: weathered wood grain, the way shadows fell across stone, the precise moment when dawn light first touched a mountainside. His appreciation for her seemed to follow the same pattern of careful attention and authentic appreciation. Their conversations revealed layers of compatibility that surprised them both. Hattie discovered that Silas, despite years of relative solitude, was remarkably well read. He carried books in his saddlebags, volumes of poetry, philosophy, and natural history that he had read and reread during long mountain winters. "Loneliness teaches a man to appreciate good company," he explained when she expressed surprise at his literary knowledge, "including the company of authors who understand the world better than most folks." In return, Hattie shared her own love of reading and her secret passion for writing. She had filled several journals with observations about frontier life, character studies of the people around her, and stories that helped her make sense of her experiences. "You write beautifully," Silas said after reading a piece she had timidly shared about the changing seasons. "You see details most people miss, and you find meaning in ordinary moments. That's a rare gift." "It's just scribbling," she protested. But his praise warmed her in ways she was still learning to accept. "No," he said firmly, "it's seeing, really seeing, and then finding words to help others see it too. That's what the best writers do." These quiet afternoons in the boarding house parlor became islands of peace in what was otherwise a storm of social controversy. The town had divided itself into factions over the relationship, with most people falling into the category of those who found the whole affair somewhere between scandalous and ridiculous. Edgar Thompson, his pride still smarting from the public humiliation, had become the unofficial leader of those opposed to the courtship. He spent his evenings in the saloon, regaling anyone who would listen with predictions of disaster. "Mark my words," he would say, whiskey making him bold, "that mountain man will tire of playing with damaged goods soon enough, and when he does, we'll be stuck with her permanently. A woman like that brings bad luck wherever she goes." Reverend Pike had taken a more subtle but equally damaging approach, incorporating veiled references to the dangers of unequal yoking into his sermons. His wife, Constance, organized prayer meetings specifically dedicated to seeking divine guidance for those who have lost their way in matters of the heart. But there were unexpected allies as well. Dr. Morrison had quietly expressed his approval to several patients, noting that Miss Caldwell seemed happier and healthier than he had seen her since her arrival. "Love is the best medicine for many ailments," he observed, "and genuine affection can heal wounds that physicians cannot touch." Sam Tucker at the Mercantile had become more openly supportive, making a point of greeting both Hattie and Silas warmly when they shopped together. "Takes courage to follow your heart when the world's watching," he told them one morning. "I admire folks who have that kind of backbone." Most surprisingly, support had emerged from an unexpected quarter. The town's women who lived on its margins. The saloon girls, the widows without family connections, the immigrant women whose accents marked them as perpetual outsiders. They watched Silas's courtship of Hattie with something approaching hope. If a scarred woman could find love and respect, perhaps their own chances weren't as hopeless as they had believed. Mary O'Sullivan, an Irish widow who cleaned houses for wealthy families, stopped Hattie on the street one morning. "I wanted to tell you," she said in her musical accent, "that seeing you walk with your head high gives the rest of us courage. You're showing us all that we don't have to accept whatever scraps of dignity others are willing to throw our way." These words of encouragement meant more to Hattie than all the disapproval in the world. She was beginning to understand that her relationship with Silas had implications beyond her own happiness. It was challenging assumptions about worth and beauty that affected many lives. As autumn deepened toward winter, Silas began sharing his plans for the future with increasing specificity. He spoke of building additions to his mountain cabin, of creating a life that could accommodate two people rather than one. He described a garden plot where Hattie could grow vegetables and herbs, a workshop where she could pursue her sewing, and writing in peace. "You'd really want to live so far from town?" she asked during one of their evening conversations. "From other people and social connections?" "The right people will make the trip to visit us," Silas said confidently. "And the wrong people, well, their absence won't be much of a loss. Besides, we'd come to town regularly for supplies and social obligations. It's not exile, just privacy." The idea both thrilled and terrified her. She had spent so much of her adult life yearning for acceptance from society that the thought of stepping outside it entirely felt like leaping from a cliff. But as she watched Silas's face while he described their potential life together, she saw such genuine happiness and anticipation that her fears began to seem small by comparison. "It sounds like paradise," she admitted, "but are you certain you want to share it with someone like me? I come with considerable social complications, as you've surely noticed." Silas reached across the small table where they sat and covered her hand with his own. His palms were calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "Hattie," he said seriously, "I've lived alone for 5 years, and I was content. But contentment isn't the same thing as happiness. Since meeting you, I've remembered what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow, to have something worth coming home to. That's not a complication. It's a blessing." The sincerity in his voice and eyes made her believe, perhaps for the first time since her accident, that she might truly be worth loving. The pressed wildflowers in her books seemed to glow with promise, each one a small testament to a future that was beginning to feel possible rather than merely hopeful. November brought the first serious snow to the mountains surrounding Red Rock, and with it, Silas began the practical work of building a future. Each morning he would ride out to his mountain property with tools and materials purchased from the local merchants, returning to town in the evenings with plans and progress reports for Hattie. "The foundation stones are set," he told her one crisp evening as they sat in the boarding house parlor, his hands sketching the cabin's layout on a piece of paper. A good granite from the creek bed, set deep enough to withstand the winter freeze. The addition will be ready for the walls by spring. Hattie studied the rough drawing with growing wonder. The main cabin was modest but well designed, with a large stone fireplace and windows positioned to catch the morning sun. But the addition Silas was building clearly showed his intentions, a separate room that could serve as a study or sewing room, complete with built-in shelves and a writing desk positioned near a window overlooking the valley. "You're building me a room of my own," she said softly, tracing the lines with her finger. "Every woman deserves a space that's entirely her own," Silas replied. "A place where she can think and create and be herself without interruption. I want you to have that. Hattie, I want you to have everything you've been denied." The foundation stones he described seemed to represent more than just construction materials. They were the solid groundwork of a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine care. But as their personal happiness grew, so did the organized resistance to their union. The town council had called a special meeting, ostensibly to discuss matters of community standards and public morality. Hattie learned about it from Mrs. Hartwell, who delivered the news with barely concealed satisfaction. "The decent people of this town have had quite enough of this unseemly display," she announced while serving Hattie's breakfast. "It's one thing to show Christian charity to the unfortunate, but this mockery of proper courtship has gone too far. The council will put a stop to it, mark my words." That evening, Silas arrived at the boarding house with a grim expression that immediately set Hattie's nerves on edge. "I need to tell you about the council meeting," he said without preamble once they were seated in the parlor. "You attended?" Hattie asked, though she could see from his face that he had. "They didn't exactly invite me, but public meetings are public," he replied with a dry humor that didn't quite hide his anger. "Edgar Thompson has been busy organizing opposition to our relationship. He's convinced them that my presence in town, specifically my courtship of you, is somehow damaging to Red Rock's reputation." Hattie felt a familiar weight settle in her chest. "What exactly did they say?" Silas hesitated, clearly reluctant to hurt her with the details, but she pressed him until he relented. The council members, led by Edgar and supported by Reverend Pike, had constructed an elaborate argument about the dangers of encouraging inappropriate attachments in a frontier community that needed to attract respectable settlers. "They claim that allowing our courtship to continue sends the wrong message to potential residents," Silas explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. "According to Edgar, decent families won't want to settle in a place where aberrant behavior is tolerated." "Aberrant behavior," Hattie repeated flatly, "because a scarred woman found someone willing to love her. Because a man chose to see past surface appearances to the person beneath," Silas corrected firmly, "which apparently threatens their entire worldview." The specific proposals that had emerged from the meeting were both predictable and devastating. The council wanted to impose a cooling-off period during which Silas would be asked to suspend his courtship and leave town for at least 3 months. If he returned and still wished to court Hattie, they would reconsider the situation based on community sentiment at that time. "It's not legally enforceable," Silas assured her. "They can't actually force me to leave or prevent us from seeing each other. But they can make life very difficult, refuse to sell me supplies, pressure the boarding house to evict you, make it clear that anyone who supports us will face social and economic consequences." Hattie absorbed this information with a calmness that surprised her. A few months ago, the threat of increased social ostracism would have sent her fleeing back to Ohio in shame. But something fundamental had changed in her during these weeks with Silas. She had remembered what it felt like to be valued, and that knowledge had given her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Silas looked at her with an expression of fierce protectiveness. "I want to build our cabin and marry you and let them all go to hell," he said bluntly, then immediately looked apologetic for his language. "But what I want doesn't matter if it makes your life unbearable. This is your decision, Hattie. I'll stand by whatever you choose." Before she could answer, they were interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Sam Tucker knocked on the parlor door, his hat in his hands, and his face creased with worry. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, "but I thought you both should know. Edgar Thompson isn't content to wait for council pressure to work. He's been talking to some of the more, shall we say, action-oriented residents about taking matters into their own hands." The implication was clear, and Silas's expression hardened. "What kind of action?" Sam glanced around nervously before continuing. Nothing specific yet, but there's talk about making Red Rock too uncomfortable for mountain hermits who don't know their place. I'd be careful about riding alone after dark if I were you, Silas. Are you threatening me, Sam? Silas asked quietly. Lord, no, Sam replied quickly. I'm warning you. There's a difference between folks who disagree with your choices and folks who might be willing to enforce their disagreement with fists or worse. Edgar's been buying drinks for some rough characters, and the conversation has been getting uglier. Each night, after Sam left, Hattie and Silas sat in heavy silence for several minutes. The stakes of their relationship had just escalated from social disapproval to potential physical danger, and they both understood the implications. I won't let them intimidate me, Silas said finally, but I won't let them hurt you either. And staying in town might put you at risk. Hattie considered this carefully. She thought about the foundation stones Silas was laying in the mountains, solid granite set deep enough to withstand any storm. She thought about the room he was building just for her, a space where she could write and think and be herself without fear or shame. Most of all, she thought about the man sitting beside her who had shown her what love could look like when it was based on genuine respect and understanding. Then perhaps it's time to stop letting other people dictate the terms of our lives, she said with a quiet determination that surprised them both. How quickly could the cabin addition be finished? Silas studied her face carefully. If I worked through the winter, had it ready by spring. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe we don't need the approval of people whose opinions we don't respect, Hattie said, the words feeling strange but right in her mouth. Maybe it's time to build something good and let them worry about their own problems. The smile that spread across Silas's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Are you proposing to me, Miss Caldwell? I'm accepting your proposal. Mr. McGraw, she replied with a boldness that would have been impossible months before. Assuming the offer is still open. The offer will be open for as long as you want it, he assured her, taking her hands in both of his. But are you sure? Once we make this commitment, there won't be any going back to the way things were. Hattie thought about the way things had been, the isolation, the shame, the constant measurement of herself against other people's standards and finding herself wanting. Then she thought about pressed wildflowers and hand-carved combs, about foundation stones and rooms built just for her, about a man who saw beauty in scarred faces and strength in wounded hearts. I don't want to go back, she said firmly. I want to go forward with you. Winter settled over Red Rock with unusual severity, bringing blizzards that turned the town into an island of flickering lamplight surrounded by white wilderness. The harsh weather forced a temporary truce in the social conflict surrounding Hattie and Silas. Survival took precedence over scandal when temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there for weeks at a time. It was during one of these storms that Hattie discovered the depth of her own courage and the true nature of the community she'd been trying so desperately to join. The crisis began with a frantic pounding on the boarding house door just after midnight, loud enough to wake everyone in the building. Dr. Morrison stood on the porch, snow-covered and breathing hard from his ride through the storm. Miss Caldwell, he said urgently, I need your help. Martha Kowalski is having complications with her birth, and my hands are too unsteady for the delicate work required. I've heard you have experience with healing and midwifery. Hattie had indeed learned such skills from her mother, who had served as an unofficial midwife in their Ohio community. But she hadn't practiced in years, and the idea of being responsible for both a mother and child's life in the midst of a crisis made her hands shake. Doctor, surely there's someone more qualified. There isn't, he said bluntly. The nearest trained midwife is in Eleanor, impossible to reach in this weather. Mrs. Kowalski is in serious trouble, and her baby is breech. If we don't act quickly, we'll lose them both. Mrs. Hartwell had appeared in the hallway, drawn by the commotion. It's hardly appropriate for an unmarried woman to, she began, but Dr. Morrison cut her off with an expression of professional authority. "Propriety is a luxury we can't afford tonight," he said firmly. "Miss Caldwell, will you come?" The ride to the Kowalski farm was treacherous, with wind-driven snow making visibility nearly impossible. Silas had appeared from somewhere, Hattie. Suspected he had been keeping watch near the boarding house despite the weather, and insisted on accompanying them to ensure their safety on the dangerous roads. "You don't have to do this," he told her quietly as they struggled through the drifts. "No one would blame you if you said it was too risky." But Hattie had already made her decision. A woman was suffering, possibly dying, and she had skills that might help. The same strength that had carried her through months of social ostracism now propelled her towards someone who needed her abilities more than they needed her acceptability. The Kowalski cabin was a scene of barely controlled panic when they arrived. Martha lay writhing in a bed soaked with sweat and blood, her husband Stefan pacing frantically while their 3 other children huddled in the corner, wide-eyed with terror. The air was thick with the smell of fear and impending tragedy. Dr. Morrison had been right about his limitations. His arthritis-gnarled hands, so skilled at setting bones and dispensing medicines, were too stiff for the precise manipulations required to safely deliver a breech baby. But Hattie's fingers, strengthened by years of detailed needlework, possessed both the dexterity and sensitivity needed for the delicate task. "Martha," she said softly, taking the laboring woman's hand, "I'm Hattie Caldwell. Dr. Morrison has asked me to help with your baby's delivery. I know this is frightening, but I want you to trust me. We're going to bring your child safely into the world." What followed was the longest night of Hattie's life. Working by lamplight with Silas holding additional candles for illumination, she guided Martha through the complicated delivery with a combination of medical knowledge, intuitive understanding, and sheer determination. Dr. Morrison provided support and encouragement, but the crucial work fell to Hattie's steady hands and calm voice. "I can feel the baby's legs," she told Martha during one critical moment. "Just breathe with me now, don't push yet, let me turn him just a little more." The braided leather rope that Silas wore as a belt became an impromptu tool, used to create traction when conventional methods failed. Everything in that cabin became part of the effort to save 2 lives. Kitchen towels became sterile cloths, whiskey served as antiseptic, and prayer became the background music to desperate medical intervention. Dawn was breaking when baby Joseph Kowalski finally emerged, blue and still, into Hattie's waiting hands. For a terrifying moment, the cabin fell completely silent except for Martha's exhausted breathing. Then Hattie began the rhythmic stimulation she had learned from her mother, working to clear the infant's airways and encourage his first breath. "Come on, little one," she whispered, her own breath held in desperate hope. "Come on." The baby's first cry was the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard. Stefan wept openly as Hattie placed his son in his arms, while the other children crept forward to meet their new brother. Martha, exhausted but smiling, reached out to touch Hattie's hand. "Thank you," she whispered in her accented English. "You saved us both. I will never forget." The journey back to town took place in transformed weather. The storm had passed, leaving the world clean and bright under fresh snow. But more than the landscape had changed during that long night. Word of the successful delivery spread through Red Rock faster than the morning news, carried by Dr. Morrison, who made no secret of his admiration for Hattie's skill and courage. "That woman has nerves of steel and hands blessed by God himself," he told anyone who would listen. "Mrs. Kowalski and her baby are alive because Hattie Caldwell was willing to risk everything to help a neighbor in need." The Polish immigrant community, often marginalized by Red Rock's more established residents, embraced Hattie with fierce gratitude. Stefan Kowalski appeared at the boarding house 2 days later with a hand-carved cradle as a gift, his English thick with emotion as he tried to express his family's debt. "You come to our house, always welcome," he said, pressing the cradle into her hands. "My Martha, she say you are angel. My children, they call you Aunt Hattie now. You are family. Other immigrant families began seeking Hattie out for medical advice, treating her with a respect that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with her demonstrated competence. Word spread beyond the Polish community to the German farmers, the Irish railroad workers, and the scattered native families who traded with the town. For the first time since arriving in Red Rock, Hattie found herself genuinely needed rather than merely tolerated. Her skills as a healer, combined with her natural empathy and hard-won understanding of suffering, made her invaluable to people who had little access to formal medical care. "You're becoming quite the local celebrity," Silas observed with obvious pride as they walked together past a group of children who waved enthusiastically at Hattie's approach. "Half the town is reconsidering their opinions about you." "Not all of them," Hattie replied, nodding toward Edgar Thompson, who crossed the street rather than acknowledge their presence. "Some people are too invested in their prejudices to change them, no matter what evidence they're presented with." "Their loss," Silas said simply. "The people who matter, the people with sense and decency, they're beginning to see what I saw from the beginning." The braided leather rope had been returned to him, but its brief service as a medical tool had transformed it into something more significant. It represented the intertwining of their lives, the way individual strengths could be combined to create something more powerful than either could achieve alone. As they walked past the site where the town council had once debated the appropriateness of their relationship, Hattie reflected on how dramatically her position in the community had shifted. She was no longer the pitied outcast seeking acceptance from those who considered themselves her betters. She had become someone with valuable skills, someone who contributed meaningfully to the community's welfare. "Spring can't come soon enough," Silas said, his eyes on the mountains where their future cabin waited for completion. "I want to wake up next to you in our own bed, in our own house, where nobody can question our right to be happy." Hattie squeezed his arm, feeling the solid strength of the man who had seen her worth when she had forgotten it herself. "Soon," she promised, "very soon." But even as she spoke, she remained unaware of the forces gathering against them, the desperate measures that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. The rope that had helped save a life would soon become a symbol of the bonds that threatened to strangle their dreams. The revelation came in the form of a faded military medal discovered in the most unlikely of places. Hattie was helping to clean the church basement after a community supper when she found the tarnished bronze star wedged behind a loose board in the wall. At first, she thought it was simply a forgotten memento left by some long-departed parishioner. But when she examined it more closely in the lamplight, her breath caught in her throat. The inscription was still legible, despite years of neglect. "For exceptional valor in combat, Captain S. McGraw, 7th Cavalry Regiment." The date placed it during the height of the Indian Wars, and the accompanying citation spoke of heroic actions during a desperate battle that had saved an entire settlement from destruction. Silas McGraw was not simply a mountain hermit seeking solitude, as he had led everyone to believe. He was a decorated war hero who had disappeared from military service under mysterious circumstances. The discovery left Hattie with a whirlwind of questions and emotions. Why had Silas hidden his military past? What had driven a celebrated officer to abandon his career and seek isolation in the wilderness? And most troubling of all, what other secrets might the man she loved be keeping from her? She confronted him that evening during their usual walk, the medal heavy in her coat pocket like a weight of uncertainty. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, but the beauty of the landscape felt muted by her apprehension. "Silas," she began carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." He must have heard something in her tone, because he stopped walking and turned to face her with an expression of concern. "What's troubling you, Hattie?" She withdrew the medal from her pocket and held it out to him. The effect was immediate and dramatic, All color drained from his face, and his entire body went rigid with what looked like carefully controlled panic. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the church basement. But that's not the important question, is it? The important question is why you never told me you were a war hero." Silas took the medal with hands that trembled slightly, staring at it as if it were a snake that might strike him at any moment. "Because I'm not a hero," he said quietly. "Heroes don't run away from their responsibilities. Heroes don't abandon their men when they're needed. And most. Tell me what happened," Hattie said, her voice gentle but firm. "Whatever it is, I need to know. We can't build a future on secrets, Silas." For a long moment she thought he might refuse to answer. He stood motionless in the fading light, the medal clenched in his fist, his face a mask of old pain and bitter regret. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one caused him physical discomfort. The citation doesn't tell the whole story," he began. "Yes, I led a successful defense against a war party that was threatening the settlement at Bear Creek. But what it doesn't mention is that the attack was partly my fault in the first place. The story that emerged was one of military politics, conflicting orders, and a young officer's tragic miscalculation. Silas had been ordered to establish peaceful negotiations with a band of Lakota who were seeking safe passage through territorial lands. But pressure from his commanding officer and local settlers had led him to take a harder stance than the situation warranted. "I thought I was being strong," he said, staring out at the darkening mountains. "I thought showing force would prevent conflict. Instead, it guaranteed it. When the shooting started, good men died on both sides, men who might have lived if I had been wiser, more patient. The successful defense that earned him the medal had come at a terrible cost. Half his men had been killed or wounded, and several civilian families had lost loved ones in the fighting. While his superiors praised his tactical brilliance, Silas carried the weight of every life lost due to his initial misjudgment. After the ceremony where they gave me this," he said, holding up the medal, "I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't look at myself in a mirror. Every time someone called me a hero, I felt like a fraud. So I resigned my commission and disappeared into the mountains where I couldn't hurt anyone else with my decisions." Hattie absorbed this revelation with a mixture of sadness and understanding. The man she had fallen in love with was even more complex than she had imagined. Not just a gentle soul seeking peace, but a wounded warrior carrying the burden of command decisions gone wrong. "You were young," she said finally. "You made a mistake under impossible circumstances. That doesn't erase the lives you saved later, doesn't it?" Silas asked bitterly. "Those families at Bear Creek might disagree. The widows of the men who died under my command might have different opinions about my heroism." But Hattie's attention had been caught by something else entirely. As Silas spoke about Bear Creek and the political pressures that had influenced his decisions, a terrible possibility began to form in her mind. The timeline he described, the location of the settlement, the involvement of local interests in escalating the conflict, it all matched too closely with stories she had heard about her own family's history. "Silas," she said slowly, "what was the name of the family that was leading the push for military action against the Lakota?" He looked at her with confusion. "I'm not sure I should—" "Please," she pressed. "It's important." "Caldwell," he said reluctantly. "James Caldwell. He owned most of the land around Bear Creek and wanted the Indians removed so he could expand his cattle operation. Why do you—" He stopped mid-sentence as the implications hit him. "James Caldwell was my uncle," Hattie whispered. "My father's brother." The silence that followed was profound and terrible. They stood facing each other in the gathering darkness, the weight of this new understanding settling between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. "Your uncle," Silas repeated numbly, "the man whose greed helped start the whole mess that got so many people killed. And you're the officer who tried to negotiate peace before being forced into a war you didn't want." Hattie replied. "The man who's been blaming himself for decisions that weren't entirely his own." But there was more. Much worse revelations were yet to come. As they grappled with this first shocking connection, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows near the edge of town. Edgar Thompson had been following them, hoping to gather ammunition for his campaign against their relationship. What he had overheard was worth more than he could have imagined. The next morning brought a visitor to the boarding house who changed everything Hattie thought she knew about her own identity. Jeremiah Watts was a lawyer from Eleanor, a thin, precise man with papers that contained the power to reshape her entire understanding of her place in the world. "Miss Caldwell," he said, after Mrs. Hartwell had reluctantly shown him to the parlor, "I've been searching for you for quite some time. Your Uncle James left specific instructions that you were to be informed of your inheritance upon reaching your 26th birthday or upon his death, whichever came first." Hattie stared at him in confusion. "My Uncle James is dead?" "Yes, ma'am. Passed away 2 months ago. And according to his will, you are now the sole owner of approximately 12,000 acres of prime Montana grazing land, including the Bear Creek settlement and surrounding territory." The papers he spread before her told a story that recontextualized everything about her presence in Red Rock. She was not a desperate woman seeking marriage to escape poverty. She was one of the largest landowners in the territory. The accident that had scarred her face had not been an accident at all, but a deliberate act of sabotage by her cousin Robert, who had expected to inherit Uncle James's land and had tried to eliminate her as competition by making her unmarriageable. "Your cousin believed that if you remained a spinster, the property would eventually pass to the male line," Mr. Watts explained. "What he didn't count on was your uncle's specific legal provisions protecting your inheritance regardless of your marital status." As the full scope of the deception became clear, Hattie realized that Edgar Thompson's opposition to her relationship with Silas had nothing to do with morality or community standards. Edgar had been working with her cousin Robert, hoping to gain control of the Bear Creek lands through a marriage arrangement. Her refusal to marry Edgar had threatened a conspiracy that involved theft, fraud, and attempted murder. "There's more," Mr. Watts continued gently. "Your uncle left a detailed confession about his role in the Bear Creek conflict. He deeply regretted his actions and wanted you to know that Captain McGraw had repeatedly argued for peaceful resolution. The military records have been corrected to reflect the true circumstances of those events." Silas, who had arrived partway through this conversation, stood frozen in the doorway as the implications crashed over him like an avalanche. The woman he loved was not only wealthy beyond imagining, but owned the very land where his greatest failure had taken place. The accident that had scarred her beautiful face had been a deliberate act of violence designed to rob her of her birthright. Most shocking of all, his reputation as a failed officer had been built on lies and political maneuvering by the very man whose fortune she had now inherited. "So you see," Edgar Thompson's voice cut through the silence like a blade, "your little romance is even more inappropriate than anyone realized." He stood in the parlor doorway with several other men behind him, his face twisted with malicious satisfaction. A decorated war hero and a wealthy heiress playing at being outcasts in our simple frontier town. How romantic, how completely fraudulent. Edgar Thompson's intrusion into the parlor marked the beginning of a confrontation that would determine the fate of everything Hattie and Silas had built together. Behind Edgar stood 3 other men. Her cousin Robert Caldwell, a lean wolf of a man whose eyes burned with thwarted greed. Sheriff Marcus Webb, whose uncomfortable expression suggested he was being coerced rather than convinced. And a stranger whose expensive clothes and calculating demeanor marked him as someone with significant financial interests in the outcome. "Gentlemen," Lawyer Watts said calmly, rising from his chair with professional dignity, "this is a private legal consultation. I must ask you to—" "Nothing private about theft and deception," Edgar interrupted, his voice loud enough to carry throughout the boarding house. The good people of Red Rock deserve to know they've been harboring a pair of confidence artists who've been playing them for fools. Robert Caldwell stepped forward, his resemblance to Hattie visible despite the cruel twist his features had taken over the years. "Cousin," he said with mock affection, "imagine my surprise to learn you were alive and well after all these years, and apparently quite prosperous, thanks to dear Uncle James's misguided generosity." "Hello, Robert," Hattie replied with a composure that surprised everyone present, including herself. The revelation of her true circumstances had initially shocked her, but now, facing the man who had tried to destroy her life, she felt a cold clarity settling over her thoughts. "I see you're still as charming as ever." Silas moved protectively, closer to her chair, his hand resting casually near his sidearm. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "would you like me to escort these gentlemen outside so you can continue your business with Mr. Watts in privacy?" "That won't be necessary," the well-dressed stranger interjected smoothly. "Allow me to introduce myself. Charles Brennan, territorial representative for several Eastern investment groups with interests in Montana land development. I believe we can resolve this situation to everyone's satisfaction." The Winchester rifle that hung above the boarding house mantelpiece suddenly seemed more significant as the tension in the room ratcheted higher. Mrs. Hartwell had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, her face pale with the realization that her establishment had become the center of what appeared to be a very dangerous conflict. "Mr. Brennan," Lawyer Watts said with careful neutrality, "I assume you have legal standing in this matter." "Indeed I do," Brennan replied, producing a sheaf of documents from his coat. "Your client's inheritance is subject to several outstanding debts and legal challenges that my associates are prepared to pursue through the territorial courts. However, we are willing to offer a generous settlement that would allow Miss Caldwell to retain a small portion of the estate while avoiding years of expensive litigation." Hattie examined the papers he offered, her mind working quickly despite the emotional turmoil of facing her cousin for the first time since her assault. The documents were professionally prepared, but contained several glaring inconsistencies that her years of careful reading had trained her to spot. "These debts," she said slowly, "are all to companies that didn't exist when my uncle supposedly incurred them. The signatures on several of these contracts appear to be forgeries. And the dates." She looked up at Brennan with steel in her eyes. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice that 3 of these agreements are supposedly signed after my uncle's death?" Brennan's smooth demeanor faltered slightly. "Clerical errors, I'm sure. The important point is that the estate owes substantial sums that must be satisfied before you can claim clear title to the property." "The important point," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous undertone, "is that you're attempting to defraud this lady of her lawful inheritance through fabricated documents and intimidation." Edgar Thompson had been growing increasingly agitated as the conversation continued. "This is exactly the kind of trouble that follows these people," he burst out. "First, they disrupt our peaceful community with their unseemly relationship. Now they're bringing land disputes and legal troubles right to our doorstep, our peaceful community." Dr. Morrison's voice came from the parlor entrance, where he had appeared along with Sam Tucker and several other townspeople, drawn by the raised voices. "Edgar, the only person disrupting this community's peace is you." The arrival of witnesses changed the dynamics of the confrontation significantly. Word of the dramatic scene had spread quickly through Red Rock, and people were gathering both inside and outside the boarding house to observe the showdown between Edgar's faction and the growing number of residents who had come to respect and support Hattie. Sheriff Webb finally spoke up, his discomfort with the situation evident. "Now, folks, I think we should all calm down and let the lawyers sort out the legal matters in proper venues. This isn't the place for—" "This is exactly the place," interrupted Mary O'Sullivan, the Irish widow who had been one of Hattie's earliest supporters among the marginalized women of the town. If these men think they can threaten Miss Hattie in broad daylight in front of the whole town, then the whole town has a right to hear what's being said. Stefan Kowalski appeared behind her, still carrying the grateful devotion of a man whose wife and child had been saved by Hattie's skill. "Miss Hattie is good woman," he said in his heavily accented English. "She helped my family when nobody else could. If these men want to hurt her, they have to go through us first." The boarding house parlor was now packed with people, and the crowd spilled out into the hallway and onto the front porch. Lines were being drawn, not just around Hattie and Silas, but around fundamental questions of justice, community values, and the right of powerful interests to override individual claims. 2. Happiness and property. Robert Caldwell surveyed the crowd with growing alarm. This was not how the confrontation was supposed to unfold. The plan had been to isolate Hattie, pressure her into accepting a fraudulent settlement, and divide any assets with Edgar and Brennan. The presence of so many hostile witnesses was complicating everything. Uncle James left very specific instructions about how his estate was to be handled, Hattie said, addressing not just the men who had come to rob her, but the entire crowd of neighbors and community members. He wanted to make amends for the harm his actions had caused during the Bear Creek conflict. He wanted his land used to help build something better than the greed and prejudice that had characterized his own life. She stood up, moving to stand beside Silas, with a dignity that transformed her from victim to leader. That land includes sites where soldiers died, where families were destroyed by conflict that could have been avoided. It's sacred ground that deserves better stewardship than men who see it only as a source of profit. Lawyer Watts had been making careful notes during the entire confrontation, documenting statements that would prove valuable in the legal battles to come. "Miss Caldwell," he said formally, "do you wish to accept Mr. Brennan's settlement offer, or do you prefer to pursue your full legal rights to the inheritance?" "I prefer justice," Hattie replied firmly. "For myself, for the people who died at Bear Creek, and for this community that has finally learned to look past appearances to see what really matters." The loaded Winchester above the mantelpiece seemed to gleam in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the parlor windows. Everyone in the room was acutely aware that the situation was balanced on a knife's edge between legal resolution and something far more dangerous. Brennan made one final attempt at negotiation. "Miss Caldwell, I think you're underestimating the resources my associates are prepared to deploy in fighting your claim. Legal battles can be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally devastating. Are you certain you want to put yourself and your—" He glanced at Silas with obvious disdain. "Your companion through that ordeal?" "Mr. Brennan," Silas said with the quiet authority of a man who had commanded troops in battle, "I think you're underestimating the resources we're prepared to deploy in defending what's rightfully ours. Legal battles can indeed be expensive, but they can also expose fraudulent documents, forged signatures, and conspiracy charges that carry significant prison sentences." The threat was clear, and Brennan's face went pale as he realized that his attempted intimidation had backfired completely. Not only had he failed to cow Hattie into submission, but he had essentially confessed to fraud in front of a room full of witnesses. Edgar Thompson, perhaps recognizing that his dreams of easy wealth were collapsing, made a decision that would transform the confrontation from legal maneuvering to immediate physical danger. His hand moved toward the gun at his hip with the desperate recklessness of a man who had gambled everything and lost. "Nobody's taking anything that rightfully belongs to decent folks," he snarled, his fingers closing around the grip of his weapon. "I've had enough of being lectured about justice by a scarred freak and her pet mountain man." The metallic click of a hammer being cocked froze everyone in the room. But the sound hadn't come from Edgar's gun. It had come from the Winchester rifle that Sam Tucker had quietly removed from its place above the mantelpiece. "Edgar," Sam said calmly, the rifle trained steadily on the would-be gunman. I think you should reconsider your next move very carefully. This lady saved Martha Kowalski's life and her baby's life. She's earned more respect from this community than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. Now, are you going to behave like a civilized human being, or are we going to have a problem? The standoff in the boarding house parlor lasted only seconds, but those seconds stretched like hours as everyone present held their breath, waiting to see which way Edgar Thompson's desperation would push him. Sam Tucker's steady aim and calm demeanor provided a sharp contrast to Edgar's wild-eyed panic, and gradually the reality of his situation seemed to penetrate the alcohol and rage that had been driving his actions. "Put the gun down, Edgar, Sheriff," Webb said quietly, finally stepping forward to do his job, despite his obvious reluctance to cross the powerful interests that had been pressuring him. "Nobody needs to die over a property dispute." Edgar's hand trembled on his weapon, but he made no move to draw it. The room was too crowded, too many witnesses, and Sam's rifle was aimed directly at his chest from less than 10 feet away. Slowly, reluctantly, he released his grip and raised his hands in surrender. But the immediate crisis had only been defused, not resolved. Robert Caldwell and Charles Brennan were already backing toward the door, their faces set in expressions of men who were planning their next move rather than accepting defeat. "This isn't over," Robert said, his voice low and venomous as he stared at his cousin. "Uncle James may have left you his property, but dead women can't own land. Accidents happen on the frontier, especially to people who don't know when to accept reasonable offers." The threat was clear enough that even Sheriff Webb couldn't ignore it. "Mr. Caldwell," he said officially, "I'm going to have to ask you to explain exactly what you mean by that statement." But Robert and Brennan were already leaving, pushing through the crowd of townspeople with the arrogant confidence of men who believed their wealth and connections would protect them from consequences. Edgar, disarmed and humiliated, followed. Then with one last poisonous look at Hattie and Silas. "They'll be back," Dr. Morrison observed grimly as the troublemakers disappeared into the street. "And next time, they won't rely on legal intimidation or public confrontations. Men like that have other resources." Lawyer Watts began gathering his papers with practiced efficiency. "Miss Caldwell," he said, "I strongly recommend that we file these inheritance documents with the territorial court immediately, before your cousin and his associates have time to manufacture additional fraudulent claims. The sooner your legal ownership is established in the official record, the harder it will be for them to challenge." "And in the meantime," Hattie asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. "In the meantime," Silas said quietly, "you're not safe in town. Too many places for enemies to hide, too many opportunities for accidents to happen. We need to get you somewhere defendable until the legal matters are settled." The mountain cabin, Hattie realized, the isolated fortress that Silas had been building with its solid stone foundation and commanding view of the surrounding terrain. What had been planned as their romantic retreat might now become their refuge from men willing to commit murder for money. "The cabin's not finished," Silas continued, thinking out loud, "but it's defensible. Good sight lines, single approach, route, plenty of supplies cached in the area. If they want to try something, better to face them on ground we choose than to wait for them to pick the time and place." Sam Tucker set the Winchester back in its rack, but kept his hand near it. "You won't be going alone," he said firmly. "This in town owes you a debt, Miss Hattie, and we pay our debts. I'll gather some men, good men who won't be bought or intimidated." Stefan Kowalski nodded emphatically. "My brothers, my cousins, we come too. Polish men know how to fight when family is threatened, and you are family now." Dr. Morrison stepped forward with his medical bag already in hand. "You'll need someone who can tend wounds if this turns violent. I'm not much good with a gun anymore, but I can still patch holes and set bones." What followed was the most remarkable display of community solidarity that Red Rock had seen in its brief history. Within an hour, a caravan of determined men and women had assembled in front of the boarding house, armed with rifles, shotguns, medical supplies, and enough food to withstand a siege if necessary. Mary O'Sullivan appeared with a wagon loaded, with blankets and cooking equipment. "Every revolution needs good logistics," she said with a fierce smile. "And this is nothing less than a revolution, isn't it? The decent folks finally standing up to the bullies and thieves." Even Reverend Pike, who had opposed Hattie's relationship with Silas from the beginning, appeared with his hunting rifle and a grim expression of moral determination. "I may have questioned the propriety of your courtship," he told them both, "but I will not stand by while murderers and thieves hide behind false documents and threats of violence." As they prepared to leave for the mountains, Hattie found herself overwhelmed by the transformation in her circumstances. Hours earlier, she had been a scarred outcast whose greatest dream was simple acceptance. Now she was a wealthy heiress, surrounded by people willing to risk their lives to protect her rights and her happiness. The burning land deed, or rather the forged documents that Brennan had tried to use to steal her inheritance, had been secured as evidence for the territorial court. But the symbolic importance of destroying those false claims felt significant as they prepared to defend the truth through more direct means. "Are you ready for this?" Silas asked as he helped her into the lead wagon, his weathered face serious with concern. "Once we take this step, there's no going back to the quiet life we planned." Hattie looked back at the boarding house where she had spent months trying to make herself invisible, then at the faces of the people who had chosen to stand with her despite the danger, the burned remnants of forged documents scattered in the wind like ashes of deception finally put to rest. "I've been ready my whole life," she said with quiet conviction. "I just didn't know it until now." The attack came at dawn, 3 days after their arrival at the mountain cabin. Silas had expected it sooner, but Robert Caldwell and his hired men had taken time to gather reinforcements and plan their assault. They approached through the morning mist, thinking the early hour would give them the advantage of surprise. They were wrong. Silas's military training and intimate knowledge of the terrain had turned the cabin and its surroundings into a fortress. Lookouts positioned on the rocky outcroppings above the approach route had spotted the attackers while they were still a mile away, and the defenders were ready and waiting when the first shots rang out. 12 men, Stefan Kowalski reported, from his position behind the stone wall that Silas had built as a windbreak, but which now served as perfect cover. "Maybe more in the trees. They have rifles, but they don't know the ground." Hattie crouched in the cabin's main room, tending to the spare ammunition and medical supplies while fighting to control the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. This was not how she had imagined her life would unfold. Crouched in a mountain cabin while men fought a battle over her right to exist and love freely. But alongside the fear was something else, something that surprised her with its intensity. Anger. Pure, righteous anger at men who thought they could take whatever they wanted through violence and intimidation. The same fury that had sustained her through months of social ostracism now burned white-hot at the thought of these criminals threatening the people who had chosen to protect her. The first serious exchange of gunfire came when Robert's men tried to rush the cabin from 2 directions simultaneously. But Silas had anticipated this tactic, and his defenders were positioned to create deadly crossfire zones that turned the assault into a catastrophe for the attackers. "Hold your fire until they're committed," Silas called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded troops in much worse situations. "Let them get close enough that they can't retreat easily." The mountain cabin itself was built like a fort, with thick log walls and narrow windows that provided excellent defensive positions while making it nearly impossible for attackers to get clear shots at the defenders. The stone foundation that had symbolized the solid groundwork of Hattie and Silas's relationship now literally provided the foundation for their survival. Dr. Morrison had set up his medical station in the cabin's back room, and within the first hour of fighting, he was treating two wounded defenders, Sam Tucker, who had taken a bullet through his left shoulder, and young Billy Kowalski, Stefan's nephew, who had been grazed by flying splinters when a rifle shot splintered the log wall near his position. "How are we doing?" Hattie asked, as she helped the doctor bandage Sam's wound, her hands steady despite the chaos raging outside. "Better than them," Morrison replied grimly, "but this could go on for hours, and we don't know how many reinforcements they might have." That question was answered when a new sound joined the rifle fire, the thundering of hooves approaching from the valley below. For a moment, Hattie's heart sank, thinking that Robert had indeed brought additional men to overwhelm their defenses, but the riders who came into view were not enemies. Sheriff Webb led a posse of 20 men from Red Rock, including several who had opposed Hattie's relationship with Silas, but who drew the line at armed assault and attempted murder. "This is Sheriff Webb," his voice boomed across the mountainside. "You men are surrounded and outnumbered. Throw down your weapons and surrender, and you'll be treated fairly under the law." The response was a volley of rifle fire that sent the sheriff's men scrambling for cover, but the psychological impact was devastating for Robert's forces. They had expected to face a handful of defenders, not a pitched battle against half the men in Red Rock. "They're breaking," Stefan called out, as several of Robert's hired guns began retreating toward the tree line. "The ones on the left are running," but Robert Caldwell himself was not retreating. Hattie could see him through one of the cabin windows, advancing alone through the smoke and confusion with the single-minded determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. His expensive clothes were torn and dirty, his face was streaked with powder burns, but his eyes held the fanatic gleam of someone who would rather die than accept defeat. "He's making a run for the cabin," Silas shouted, but he was pinned down by rifle fire from the remaining attackers and couldn't get a clear shot at Robert's approach. In that moment, Hattie made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She grabbed the loaded pistol that Silas had left on the table for emergency protection and stepped out onto the cabin's front porch, directly into the line of fire. "Robert," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the battle-torn mountainside, "this is between us. Leave these good people out of it." Her cousin stopped his advance, perhaps 30 yards from the cabin, and stared at her with a mixture of hatred and amazement. "Little cousin," he called back, "still trying to play the noble martyr, I see. It won't work this time." "You tried to kill me once," Hattie replied, the pistol steady in her hands despite the chaos around them. 16 stitches, and permanent. Scars, because you couldn't bear the thought that Uncle James might leave his land to a woman instead of you. "You were never supposed to survive that fall," Robert snarled, all pretense of family affection finally abandoned. "Should have finished the job then, instead of hoping you'd be too ugly for any man to want." The admission of attempted murder carried clearly to everyone present, including Sheriff Webb and his men. There would be no question now about Robert's guilt, no possibility of claiming self-defense or justifiable action. "But someone did want me," Hattie said, her voice growing stronger. "Someone saw past the scars to the person beneath. Something you never could do, something you never will be able to do." She raised the pistol, aiming directly at her cousin's chest. "The question now is whether I'm going to let you live to stand trial, or whether I'm going to end this here and now." For a moment that felt like eternity, cousin faced cousin across the smoky battlefield, separated by years of hatred and a few dozen yards of mountain ground. The sounds of fighting continued around them, but the central drama had narrowed to this single confrontation between the woman who had refused to be destroyed and the man who had tried to destroy her. The wedding ring that Silas had forged from mountain gold caught the morning sunlight as Hattie's finger tightened on the trigger. It had been made from metal drawn from these very mountains, shaped by fire and hammered into a circle that symbolized eternal commitment. Now it gleamed like a promise of the future she would fight to protect. "Hattie," Silas's voice came from behind her, calm and steady despite the danger, You don't have to carry this burden. Let the law handle him." "The law?" Robert laughed bitterly. "The law that can be bought and sold like everything else? The law that would have let me steal your inheritance if you hadn't had witnesses to my threats?" He raised his own weapon, and for an instant Hattie saw her death in his eyes. But she also saw something else, the recognition that she was no longer the frightened, damaged girl he had tried to eliminate years ago. She had become someone worth dying for, someone worth killing for, someone whose love and happiness were precious enough to defend with violence if necessary. The sound of a gunshot echoed across the mountains like thunder, final and definitive. Robert Caldwell crumpled to the rocky ground, the weapon falling from his lifeless fingers, his schemes and hatred finally ended by the woman whose spirit he had never been able to break. 5 years later, Hattie McGraw stood in the garden behind their completed mountain cabin, watching her 3-year-old daughter chase butterflies through the wildflowers that grew in carefully tended beds alongside practical vegetables and herbs. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and green, and the peace that surrounded their mountain home felt as solid and permanent as the stone foundation upon which it was built. The girl, Elizabeth, named for Hattie's mother, had inherited her father's dark hair and her mother's determination, along with a fearless curiosity about the world that kept both parents constantly alert to her adventures. She showed no awareness that her mother's scarred face was anything other than normal, and her easy acceptance had helped heal wounds that went deeper than skin. "Mama, look!" Elizabeth called out, her small hands cupped around something precious. "Pretty rocks like yours!" Hattie knelt beside her daughter, admiring the collection of quartz crystals and colored stones that sparkled in tiny palms. These mountains had given them so much. Not just physical shelter and material wealth, but the space to build a life based on love rather than others' expectations. The family portrait that now hung above their mantelpiece showed a transformation that went far beyond Hattie's physical appearance. In the photograph, taken by a traveling photographer from Eleanor, she glowed with the confidence of a woman who had found her place in the world. Silas stood behind her chair with his hands on her shoulders, his weathered face soft with contentment. Between them, little Elizabeth perched on her mother's lap, her bright eyes already showing signs of the intelligence and spirit that would carry her far in life. The portrait had replaced the cracked hand mirror that had once reflected only pain and self-doubt. That mirror now rested in a trunk in the cabin's storage room, not discarded but preserved as a reminder of how far they had traveled from those dark days in Red Rock. The legal battles that followed Robert Caldwell's death had been surprisingly brief. Charles Brennan, faced with overwhelming evidence of fraud and conspiracy, had cooperated with territorial authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. The forged documents were exposed, the legitimate inheritance was secured, and Hattie found herself the owner of lands that stretched from the Bear Creek settlement to the high mountain valleys where she and Silas had built their home. But more important than the legal victory was the transformation it had brought to Red Rock itself. The community that had once been divided by prejudice and narrow thinking had been forced to confront its own values during the crisis. Many residents, seeing how quickly they had rallied to defend someone they had previously scorned, began to question other assumptions about worth and belonging. Edgar Thompson, his dreams of easy wealth thoroughly destroyed, had left Montana, entirely disappearing into the anonymity of some distant city where his reputation hadn't preceded him. His departure was mourned by no one and celebrated by many who had suffered under his influence. Sheriff Webb, chastened by how close he had come to being complicit in robbery and murder, had become a more conscientious lawman, less susceptible to pressure from wealthy interests, and more protective of individual rights regardless of social standing. Dr. Morrison still made the journey to their mountain cabin every few months, officially to check on the family's health, but really to enjoy the peaceful conversations and excellent coffee that had become legendary among their circle of friends. His arthritis had worsened over the years, but his spirit remained strong, bolstered by the knowledge that his support during their darkest hour had helped preserve something beautiful and important. Sam Tucker had become the unofficial mayor of Red Rock, his natural leadership and moral authority finally recognized by a community that had learned to value character over appearance or social connections. His mercantile had expanded into a thriving business that served not just the original settlers, but also the growing number of immigrant families who found Red Rock a welcoming place to build new lives. The Kowalski family had prospered beyond their wildest dreams, with Stefan's sons and nephews establishing successful farms throughout the valley. Martha still insisted that visitors to their home meet the angel who saved my Joseph's life, though she now had to explain to younger children why Miss Hattie was called an angel when she looked like any other happy wife and mother. Mary O'Sullivan had married a widowed Irish rancher from the next valley over, their union celebrated by a community that had learned to measure relationships by their strength and genuineness rather than their conformity to narrow social expectations. She and Hattie had become close friends, their bond forged in the shared understanding of what it meant to overcome others' limited vision. Even Reverend Pike had evolved in his thinking, his sermons now more likely to focus on the radical Christian concept of seeing the divine spark in every human being, rather than the comfortable certainties of social hierarchy. His wife, Constance, had grudgingly admitted that perhaps she had been wrong about certain people, though she still maintained that proper procedures should be followed in matters of courtship and marriage. The mountain cabin had become more than just a home. It was a destination for people seeking proof that love could triumph over prejudice, that authentic happiness was possible even in a harsh and judgmental world. Travelers would sometimes make the difficult journey just to meet the couple whose story had become legend throughout the territory. But for Hattie and Silas, the visitors and fame mattered far less than the quiet daily reality of a life built on mutual respect and genuine affection. They worked together in the garden, read to each other by the fireplace in the evenings, and shared the 1,000 small intimacies that made their union stronger with each passing year. "Tell me about when you were little, Mama," Elizabeth demanded, as they picked vegetables for the evening meal, her small hands surprisingly competent at distinguishing between ripe tomatoes and those that needed more time. It was a frequent request, and Hattie had learned to share the good memories from her childhood while saving the darker stories for when her daughter was older and better able to understand the complexities of human nature. Today, she told about learning to read beside her mother, about helping with births in their Ohio community, about the satisfaction of mending something torn and making it beautiful again. "And then you met Papa and came to live in the mountains," Elizabeth prompted, knowing the story by heart but never tiring of hearing it repeated. "And then I met Papa," Hattie confirmed, her eyes finding Silas as he worked on reinforcing the cabin's front porch, his movement still strong and sure despite the silver that now streaked his dark hair. "And learned that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come to us in ways we never expected." As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, the small family gathered on their porch to watch the mountains transform in the changing light. Elizabeth fell asleep in her mother's lap, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and protected and valued for exactly who she was. In the distance, the lights of Red Rock twinkled like earthbound stars, no longer a place of exile and rejection, but simply one more human community trying to find its way toward justice and compassion. The transformation was far from complete. Such changes took generations, but progress had been made, hearts had been opened, and the foundation for something better had been laid. Hattie touched the wedding ring that still caught the light after. All these years, its simple gold circle representing not just her union with Silas, but the larger truth they had proven together, that love, real love, had the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. It could turn outcasts into heroes, strangers into family, and scars into symbols of strength rather than shame. The pressed wildflowers from their early courtship still marked the pages of her favorite books, but now they were joined by new flowers, picked by small hands, evidence of love's continuation into the next generation. The worn wedding dress that had once symbolized abandoned hope now served as the centerpiece of Elizabeth's dress-up games, transformed from artifact of disappointment into prop for dreams of the future. In the growing darkness, as Silas lit the oil lamps that would guide them through another peaceful evening, Hattie reflected on the distance they had traveled from that first meeting in Red Rock's dusty square. She had learned that true beauty lay not in unmarked skin or social approval, but in the courage to love and be loved authentically. She had discovered that strength could grow from vulnerability, that community could emerge from the most unlikely alliances, and that the deepest happiness often came to those brave enough to stop measuring themselves by others' limited standards. The mountains stood eternal around them, their peaks touched with starlight, their valleys filled with the promise of tomorrow. Somewhere in those peaks, eagles soared on currents invisible to human eyes, following paths of their own choosing toward destinations known only to themselves. And in their mountain cabin, surrounded by the physical and emotional foundations they had built together, Hattie and Silas had found the same freedom, the liberty to love without permission, to build without approval, and to create beauty in their own image rather than the world's. The story that had begun with whispers of a monster bride had become a testament to the transformative power of seeing truly, loving bravely, and daring to believe that every person deserves happiness regardless of what others might think. In a world too often ruled by appearance and prejudice, they had proven that the deepest truths were written not on unmarked faces, but in courageous hearts, willing to look beyond surfaces, to the infinite worth that lay beneath.